All right. Thank you everybody so much for joining us. My name is Rufus Cochran. I am the Executive Director of Indiana Sciences, and we are a local nonprofit that does science communication here in Indianapolis. We've done the science of science fiction at GenCon, I think the last 5 years. This is our second GenCon online, and we're really happy to have all of you on board from all over the country. And what our nonprofit does is science communication and outreach. So if you'd like to see more of our events, we have all of our events live streamed now. You can follow us at Indiana Sciences on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, whatever you're using these days. So what our talk will be tonight is the science of science fiction. And so what we have are 3 experts that are going to talk to you about the science behind some of your favorite science fiction or fantasy. And it's a really great list of speakers that we have. We have Dr. Bill Sullivan from the IU School of Health. And I won't spoil what he's going to talk about, but there's going to be some really cool stuff. There'll be some mind control. There'll probably be some parasites. And then we will have Rachel Cochran, an electrical engineer and a PE here in Indianapolis. And she's going to talk to you about some crazy apocalypse infrastructure. And then we're going to have Matt Sowers, an amazing mechanical engineer from here in Central Indiana, holds several patents, who's going to talk to you about some of the physics and some of your favorite role-playing games that you might not have thought about. And so before we get kicked off with that, just want to say we are a nonprofit. We're fully volunteer ran. And so if you like what we do, we just ask you subscribe, follow us, check out and share what we're doing. It really helps. It allows us to kind of spread the science word around. So if we want to transition it over, Bill, if you want to take over the driver's seat, I'll stop sharing and we can have you. There we go. Sweet.
Hi, Rufus, and hello to everybody. It's really great to be here doing the science of science fiction once again. I've participated in this event, I think since Rufus started it 4 or 5 years ago, and it's always a blast. And, you know, I learn a little bit more every year we do this event, so I'm going to keep my prepared remarks a little shorter than usual, because it always seems like the Q&A, the questions, are where most of the most stimulating conversation comes from. So as Rufus said, I'm a professor at the IU School of Medicine here in Indianapolis. My day-to-day job revolves around studying infectious disease. So as you can imagine, we've been pretty busy the last couple of years, but most of my work centers on parasites and how they affect animal behavior. So we're talking about the spooky kind of parasites that can literally take over the brain and change an animal's behavior. And some of those involve human behavior as well. And that bleeds into a lot of great horror and science fiction, because one of the core themes that you see running through a lot of those films or a lot of that literature is the hijacking of someone's mind through various ways and for various reasons. So I'd be more than happy to expand upon that. But I'm trained as a cell and molecular biologist, so there's all sorts of stuff that you see in your favorite science fiction and horror movies, from Y: The Last Man all the way up to Malignant, all these newer movies, back to the classics like The Night of the Living Dead. We can talk about any and all of that in the Q&A session. But, oh, and I also wrote a book that you might have heard of. It's called Pleased to Meet Me: Genes, Germs, and the Curious Forces That Make Us Who We Are. So as I spoke about earlier, I'm very fascinated by human behavior. So I did an exploration, a study into all the hidden forces that kind of subconsciously shape our personality and behavior. So if that's something you're interested in, you can go check out that book. So The thing I want to talk about in my prepared remarks here is this subject of mind control, as it's something that's kind of near and dear to my research interests. And I wanted to provide you, or raise for discussion 4 or 5 examples of where this might be relevant in some of our favorite science fiction. So the classic behavior modification microbe, virus, if you will, is rabies. And that's been associated in a lot of science fiction, particularly in the zombie genre, but anywhere, maybe in the werewolf genre as well. But you can see like the classic symptoms of rabies in which an innocent victim procures the virus, usually through an animal bite. It makes its way up to the brain and then modifies that animal's behavior. And this is true for humans as well. Common vectors are dogs, raccoons, bats, things of that nature. But once the victim is bitten, they essentially are going to lose their humanity and return to what's been characterized as the beast within. And this is just great fodder for a lot of horror and science fiction. But rabies is a very real virus. It was actually much more prevalent before the vaccination came along in the mid 1800s, thanks to Louis Pasteur. So it's a treatable condition today, but if it's not treatable, you see the progressive disease advancing towards great aggression, a fear of water because the throat muscles get paralyzed. And there's twofold reason for that. The virus actually does that on purpose. It paralyzes those throat muscles because the virus concentrates in the saliva. And as you can imagine, that's a good strategy for the virus to employ, because if it wants to get into its next victim through biting, high concentration in the saliva is a good strategy. So it prevents the victim from swallowing and therefore accumulates a lot of saliva, this foaming at the mouth that is classic in movies like Cujo or in some of the zombie movies. And that's what gets transmitted during the bite to spread the virus. We don't know exactly how the rabies virus takes over the brain. Even though rabies is one of the oldest viruses that has been studied, we know so little about the neurobiology in our own head that rabies virus has an advantage on us in this regard. We still don't quite know why it makes people more aggressive. We can certainly measure differences in neurotransmitters, but on a molecular level, we don't know what's going on. So building off that, I want to talk about a couple other infectious entities that you probably haven't heard of that really can be seen vividly in science fiction. But these are real world examples. And that's the kind of terror that I think is even more frightening, because that they're real world examples. So what we see on the screen can actually be translated into reality. So there's this particular microbe, it's a fungus, it's called zombie ant fungus, and it really does live up to its name. Maybe you've heard of it. It's gotten a little more press than some of the others. But the way this works is that it basically commandeers an ant's nervous system in order to spread itself around. You'll see a common theme with these microbes that I'm talking about, the same way you see it in film. The symptoms that they produce in the parasitized organism are not superfluous. That those are purposefully designed and selected by evolution to help that microbe transmit to another victim. So the symptoms are not coincidental. And that's very true for the zombie ant fungus. So the ant catches the fungus basically by walking through spores that are on the forest floor, picks up the spores, and they get implanted into the ant's body and start to grow and spread, and they take over the brain eventually. And once the fungus reaches the brain, things go really bad for the ant. It really, if there's any sort of consciousness that the ant experiences, that's when it's erased, when this fungus reaches the brain. Basically, what it'll make the ant do is leave the, usually, ants march in a line. It'll leave that line and kind of go off on its own, climb up a small plant or bush that is in the wilderness, and attach itself to the underside of a leaf. Okay, it'll chomp down with its mandibles and it sink its teeth into this leaf and hang on really tight. And then as the fungus continues to grow, it releases spores. And through gravity, they just fall to the ground. And here's where the evolutionary magic or terror, however you want to call it, factors in. Those spores rain right down on his ant buddies that are crawling on the forest floor. And therefore, it spreads itself to its next victim. So that's how the zombie ant fungus takes over an ant. And another one I want to talk about actually focuses on ants, just out of coincidence as well. I don't mean to pick on the ants, but they're very well studied in terms of behavioral changes, because in an ant's life, unlike a human's, their behavior is really predictable. So when an abnormality emerges, scientists can they really take interest in that and can dissect it. So this other process is caused by a nematode. A nematode is a microscopic round worm that can also parasitize an ant. And when this happens, something really remarkable to the ant takes place. There's behavioral changes as well as morphological changes, changes to its body. So the behavior change is similar to what the zombie ant fungus does. The ant will leave the colony and basically go out to the center of a leaf, but on the top side, and just sit there on top of this leaf. Now, the changes that happen to the body, this parasitic nematode causes the ant's abdomen to swell up and turn red. Okay, so it really doesn't even look like an ant anymore. And in fact, if you had a bird's eye view and see this little red dot, on a leaf, you might think that's a berry. And that's exactly what birds mistake this parasitized ant for. Birds don't normally eat ants. I guess they're not very tasty. They don't have a high nutritional value, but berries do. And birds think that that ant is a berry. They gobble it up. Now, what's the evolutionary reason behind that? Well, now the nematode can spread itself around a very wide radius, because that bird is going to fly all around and poop at some time. And as the nematode works its way through the bird, its eggs get pooped out, and that's how it spreads around. So it's a really remarkable hijacking of an ant in order to spread itself around. Really remarkable that that's a microscopic nematode that has figured out how to, play nature to its advantage. So I'll talk about one last example before we let our next speaker take over. And this one is very close to me because it's the one we study the most in my laboratory at IU School of Medicine. And it's one that 25% of the people listening here are infected with, and they don't even know it. So I'm talking about a parasite. It's called Toxoplasma gondii. And 1 out of 4 Americans are infected with this parasite. That means the parasite is living in a dormant form in that person's head, okay? And it sounds pretty unsettling, and you're probably like, why have I not heard about this? It's because the parasite is very stealthy in human beings and most other animals for that matter. It doesn't cause overt symptoms of illness. It actually just triggers a very low-grade immune response, finds its way to the brain, and then settles in for the rest of that organism's life with the hope that that organism is eaten by a cat, okay? Any species of cat, whether it be the felines we all know and love at home, or lions or cougars or cheetahs or panthers or any cat breed. So why the cat? Good question. The cat is what we call the definitive host of this parasite. It's the only organism on Earth that we know of where the parasite undergoes the sexual stage of its life cycle. Okay, so just like any other creature, at the end of the day, the meaning of life is sex. It wants to get into that cat so it can reproduce, okay, experience the benefits of genetic hybridization, and be expelled by the cat in order to get around. The cat secretes these toxoplasma eggs into the environment, and they're stable for up to 1 or 2 years. And they have thoroughly penetrated the food and water system all over the planet. There is not a single animal species that's been isolated that has not been contaminated with toxoplasma. That's how remarkably promiscuous this parasite is. So it gets around not only through the cat, but through predation. Because in addition to going to the brain, these parasite cysts can settle into muscle tissue. So it can spread when one organism eats another, or when humans don't cook their meat sufficiently. If that meat happens to have these parasite cysts inside, and that's quite common in pig and lamb, we can catch the parasite that way as well. So there's a number of routes of different ways we can catch it. And here's where things get really kind of haunting and just great stuff to draw upon for science fiction. The parasite, as I said, goes to the brain and it causes behavioral changes. These are best demonstrated in a rodent model. We can infect mice with a sublethal dose of toxoplasma parasites, and they won't look sick. And by 3 weeks, they'll have all kind of parasite cysts in their brain. We can measure and quantify that, but you'd never know it looking at the mouse. It looks normal. Things get interesting if you start doing behavioral studies on the mouse. The mouse is not very good anymore at making its way through a maze. It's more anxious. It's bold. It starts moving around a lot. It has some very bizarre behavioral changes associated with it. The most striking one, probably as a consequence of all these factors I mentioned, is that it's no longer afraid of cats. And where's that parasite actually want to go? It wants to get into the gut of a cat. So it seems that this parasite has manipulated the brain of rodents in order to throw themselves at the cat, make themselves easy prey so that the parasite gets to where it wants to go. I'll close with a question that might be on your mind. What is this parasite doing if it's in my brain? And that's one of the things my lab is interested in studying. We do not have a good answer for that because this is pretty recently discovered phenomenon in the rodents. But correlation studies have been done that suggest that people who are infected with this parasite are indeed more anxious, just like we see in rodents. They are more susceptible to a variety of neuropsychoses. The most common correlations are schizophrenia and rage disorder. And someone else did a study of car accidents because there was a lot of data available. They could do a retrospective study. If you're infected with the Toxoplasma parasite, you're 3 times more likely to be involved in a car accident, which makes sense if this parasite is making animals reckless and more anxious. So again, I caution that those are correlation studies, not causation. And I don't mean to make anyone lose any sleep, or I certainly don't want to prompt anyone to get rid of their beloved cats. You certainly don't need to do that. Reasonable precautions and taking care of the litter box can prevent any spread from humans. And of course, cooking your meat and drinking clean water helps minimize transmission as well. So that's it for my prepared remarks. I think I talked enough. And if you guys want to follow up about anything I said or other aspects of biology that you see in your favorite science fiction, be happy to do that after the other speakers. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Phil. This is always a fantastic topic to have during these science fiction talks, because you realize so much of these mechanisms that we think about could be used for mind control, like how would that actually work in a movie? How could these things change like that? You realize nature's already got this giant toolbox of ways to manipulate different living beings from other living beings. So it's always a great presentation. So before we start our next speaker, we've had more people come in as we've been going. Bill Sullivan just spoke, an amazing professor at IU School of Health, author of the book Pleased to Meet Me. It's all about the unseen forces that shape our behavior and who we are. So If you're interested in this kind of science stuff, it's a great book to check out. Once again, we are Indiana Sciences. We are a nonprofit here in Indianapolis that does science communication. So if you like the stuff we're doing, follow us at Indiana Sciences. We're all volunteer. Just love doing this kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Cochran, PE professional engineer, electrical engineer here in Indianapolis. And she's going to talk to you about the power grid and about the apocalypse versus Indianapolis power and light. So I'm not going to steal any of your thunder. I'm going to stop talking. Rachel, turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a good virtual GenCon. I just want to say I don't plan to get rid of my cat, but every time I listen to Bill speak, I do like my cat just a little bit less. I have read Bill's book more than once because it's really great. And then also we had a book club, so I wanted to refresh my memory. And I can't wait to read his next book, which, I hope you're working on. So anyway, like Rufus said, my name is Rachel Cochran. I'm a licensed electrical engineer. I'm a PE. And I primarily work, I design systems for healthcare facilities. So it's been a busy couple years. You might have noticed a lot of changes around facilities if you've been to the doctor recently. But my first passion and what I actually concentrated in college was power systems, so generation, transmission, distribution. And so what I want to talk to you about this evening is what actually happens in an apocalypse, because movies and shows get it so frustratingly wrong. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. Like I said, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm a dog mom. If we were in person, I would offer to show you pictures of my dog on my phone afterwards. I coach high school robotics, and I co-founded Indiana Sciences with Rufus. And just to plug it again, you can follow us at Indiana Sciences on lots of different platforms. So I originally started this presentation several years ago, and I focused on zombies. And as I watched more and more sci-fi shows, I just got more and more frustrated. And so this is actually really all-encompassing for any like apocalyptic type movie or show. And there's one that really, really makes me mad. So this Revolution show, it was on Netflix for a couple of years. I don't know if you've seen it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that particular show makes me just so furious. But there's a lot of different genres out there. Of course, my favorite zombie movie, but there are a lot of them out there that get this particular aspect, how we lose power, and just what happens when we lose power. They get that aspect wrong. So I'm going to ruin some shows for you, and I apologize, but I have to set the record straight. There are three areas of vulnerability when it comes to the power utilities. So there are the generation facilities, the power plants, transmission, what we call the grid, and distribution, what you see in your neighborhood. So if you live in a neighborhood like mine where everything is above ground, you can look out maybe your back window or your front window and see a pole, cylindrical pole transporter mounted on the light pole, and a huge tangle of cords, because every other utility hangs their cables off of the power utility poles as well. It's not a good look, but whatever. We love our neighborhood, so we're not moving. Okay, so generation. So generation can be coal-fired, it can be natural gas, it can be nuclear, it can be hydroelectric. And then we also have, so there's like the green energy production. So we have windmills, we have solar arrays, that type of thing. So with the more traditional, the more dirty processes, so we have coal-fired, which is, if you're in Indiana, like we are, almost everything we have here is coal-fired. And coal-fired power plants need to be restocked or refueled multiple times a week. It depends on the season. It depends on, it really just depends on demand, but most coal-fired plants are getting deliveries and getting refueled 2 to 3 times a week. Natural gas, obviously that's going to rely on pressure in the line, and so natural gas piping. So if you have a natural gas water heater, furnace, that type of thing, you get natural gas in your house because there is pressure in that piping. Nuclear and hydroelectric are a little bit different. So let me go back a step. So like I said, with coal-fired, we said they're getting multiple deliveries a week. So in the event of an apocalypse, making deliveries to a coal-fired power plant, let's take a zombie apocalypse. So people are being turned into zombies left and right. Deliveries aren't going to make it to coal-fired power plants. I'm making some assumptions on this, obviously, but just from the shows and the movies that I've seen, that's not going to be a priority. And so coal-fired power plants are going to be some of the first ones to fail to deliver energy to their customers. Natural gas, again, just based on, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to go back to zombies. But if you have zombies, you're not driving into work every day. There are probably pileups all over the major roads, and those power plants just aren't going to be maintained like they should be. Nuclear, it's a little bit different. So nuclear facilities are much more secure. Because obviously you don't just want like Joe Schmo to be able to walk in off the street and access like a nuclear facility. So if people could make it to that nuclear facility, they would be safer. And honestly, it could run as long as they had generators running. Because you have to keep the spent fuel rods cool. So you have to have some way of cooling the spent fuel rods, and as long as you can do that, you can keep producing nuclear energy. Once you stop keeping those spent fuel rods cool, that's when you get meltdowns. So if you recall the Fukushima power plant back in, I believe it was 2010 or 2011, the meltdown that occurred was the spent fuel rods not being cooled. Hydroelectric plants are kind of, I don't want to say self-sufficient, but they're very old school in the way that they just take mechanical, they take kinetic energy and they turn it into electricity. And so it's really just like water falling over turbines, to really, really oversimplify it. And if you don't have equipment breaking down, a hydroelectric plant could theoretically just keep running and running until the equipment physically broke down. So those could go a little bit longer. Talking about green energy, with photovoltaic arrays, so solar panels, they have to be clean. So if you're talking about, what is it, the day after next, where the whole world freezes over, you're going to have frost and you're going to have snow and like many, many layers of that on top of your array. And the sun is just not going to get to your photovoltaic array and produce any output. And that's, well, in addition with the just physical vulnerability of a solar panel, keeping it clean is like the #1 thing. And in many apocalypse scenarios, then you're back to zombies, blood and guts everywhere. Day after next, it's frozen over. You know, you just, if it can't effectively have the UV rays hitting it, you're not getting any power. And with wind turbines actually require they require I don't know if maintenance is the right word, but counterintuitively, you can't just let a wind turbine spin out of control when it gets really windy. Above a certain mile per hour, you actually have to shut those down because you'll have failure in the blades if they're going too fast. And that speed obviously is going to depend on size and some other factors. But if you don't have people to operate those controls, those wind turbines are not only going to fail, but they're going to fail catastrophically. And if you live near a wind farm and you haven't already died in the apocalypse, when one of those turbines fails, those blades, which can be twice as long as a semi truck, those blades are just going to snap off and destroy anything in their path. So a lot of different failure modes for every type of power generation. Now, when you get to transmission, this is what people call the grid, and this is if you've seen like a substation near your neighborhood, everything kind of upstream of that is going to be transmission, and then everything downstream is going out to your neighborhood or it's going out to a shopping center. That's distribution. And this is the most vulnerable. This is almost all completely above ground. And again, making some assumptions here. Days 1 through 3, sure, it could totally stay operational, possibly if the equipment was, somewhat robust. If the equipment wasn't in the direct path of an apocalyptic event, but you are going to start to see some failures on day 1 through 3. Days 4 through 6, I mean, pretty much everything is going to fail. And I'm about to talk about just how vulnerable all this infrastructure above ground is. And day 7 and beyond, depending on the type of apocalyptic event, if it's the world freezing over and it's ice over everything instantly, you're going to have a lot more failures than that 1 to 3. I don't know if you've ever been in an ice storm yourself, but if you get ice on the power lines, they start to sag and you start to get exploding transformers and losing power, and it's just not a good situation. And then, of course, if you have some kind of explosion or some San Andreas fault type, just physical apocalypse, geotechnical apocalypse event, it's just going to destroy this equipment. So depending on your type of apocalypse, you're going to have maybe 1 to 7 days tops of power still coming to your home, if you've made it through the initial event. And so distribution. So this is really probably what we're all most familiar with seeing. And all 3 of these photos were taken from my property. So if you look at that top photo, with no warning whatsoever, we just lost power. The weather was clear. It was a beautiful day. I went out on the porch and there was just a cherry picker truck just out there doing something. Who knows? Don't know what, but whole neighborhood lost power for like 5 hours. That bottom left, let me go to the bottom right one. Squirrels. This was taken from my backyard. We have a squirrel highway along our privacy fence from the trees in the front yard to the trees in the backyard. And I'm honestly more surprised that they don't blow themselves up more. But anybody that lives near, a squirrel super center is probably familiar with the brief pop, mild explosion, and the smell of singed squirrel when they blow themselves up on transformers and neighborhoods. They're not smart. They have strength in numbers. It's quantity over quality for the squirrel life. And then this bottom left picture, this is new to my presentation. This was taken this past weekend. So if any of you live in Indianapolis, in the Bronzersville, Butler, Tarkington, Meridian, Kessler neighborhood, you did not have power for anywhere from like 4 to 8 hours Sunday evening. This young man was playing Pokemon Go and driving. Not smart, don't do it. Pokemon Go is great, just do it when you're not driving. And he actually hit, I'm not sure, we've all been victims of physics before, you know, tripping upstairs and whatnot. And I'm not sure how he got himself into this situation, but what you're looking at here is he somehow came at this pole and obviously the cables that carry the electricity to your house. And as his car started to fall back off of them, the front of his car was held up by those distribution lines, it was a very dangerous situation. So just on a day-to-day basis, this infrastructure is so vulnerable, and we don't take care of it. We don't trim our trees. We don't pay attention when we're driving. We feed the squirrels, so they're overpopulated. And so this part of the power the power system is going to start failing immediately. I mean, just immediately. If you take, again, the ice storm, the apocalyptic ice storm, these lines, because they're the distribution lines, they're a much smaller diameter conductor. And so when you get ice on these lines, they're not as robust, and they start sagging much worse. If you have a zombie situation, somebody gets bitten while they're driving their Uber, you know, being an Uber and a Lyft driver is really dangerous these days, and you just put a zombie apocalypse on top of that, and it's worse. So, you know, somebody was turned into a zombie while they're driving, and you have this situation that this unfortunate young man had in my neighborhood last weekend. And, you know, the San Andreas fault type thing, you know, this stuff is just falling into the earth. So this is the stuff that fails immediately. I mean, and it fails often, just in our day-to-day lives. So this is all to say, if there's an apocalyptic event, we're not really going to have power. You can't count on keeping your phone charged and being able to communicate with your disaster preparedness team. You really need to have a backup plan that doesn't involve having power. And I do want to hit, for, I don't know, like the 0.1 of the population that has watched this show, Revolution, where for whatever reason they just lose power. Like there's some like high-tech government secret weapon, and it just, everything loses power. Batteries don't work anymore. Like nothing works anymore. And if somehow they get the power to work like 15 years later, and everything just turns on the way that it was before. And so I really ask you to just look at these pictures again and tell me if you think that that's realistic. Because I can suspend disbelief, and the show was okay, and then that episode came on, and there's just no way. You know, even if we get, you know, a decade or two down the road after an apocalyptic event and we're rebuilding society, our power systems are going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up. And to be honest, it'd be a great time to rethink how we power and what our infrastructure looks like. Not that I am advocating for an apocalyptic event. A lot of us wouldn't survive it, and that would not be good. So how do we know what happens? Aside from watching squirrels get blown up and teenage boys not paying attention when they're driving, how do we know what happens and why we just won't have power? So in 2003, there was a Northeast blackout, and there were 10 million in Canada, 45 million in the United States. without power. And this is a software bug that, so I don't know if you probably experienced a brownout where you lose power for a minute or everything kind of dims for a second and comes back on. That's a brownout. And what that is the transmission or distribution line redistributing the load. Say a transformer blows up for whatever reason. There's a lot of automated processes that happen that just redistribute the electricity to where the demand is. And so you see a brief interruption, but you don't lose power for 2 days. And what there was a bug in the software that did not allow the operators to manually redistribute the load after a transmission line was basically just taken out by overgrown trees. And remember that comment that we just don't trim our trees. We as property owners have a responsibility to trim trees or to call the power company when there are trees overgrown in public spaces. Honestly, it's one of the biggest things we can do to keep our power infrastructure intact. In 2011, I mentioned the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. Their emergency generators were located in the lower level. And that sounds like, oh, that doesn't sound very smart. Why would you do that? Well, there are actually a lot of large corporations, hospitals, universities that they keep their generators it's called a vault in the basement. The exhaust system is really expensive. The maintenance is a little bit more expensive. But the generators are kept out of sight. They're kept out of the elements. They can't be vandalized. And so there are some benefits to doing that. And it's not uncommon. However, when you're on an island, that's just, that thought process just unfortunately did not serve them well. So, there was the tsunami that caused the initial flooding, and that took out the generators. And that's what, again, spent fuel rods couldn't be cooled, led to 3 meltdowns, hydrogen explosions, and you release the radioactive contaminants into the air. And pretty much every year, including right now, PG&E California wildfires. So if any of you happen to be calling in from Colorado, you are experiencing poor air quality because of your neighbors that don't take care of their yard, essentially. We've all had those. So in 2015, an overgrown tree fell on PG&E distribution line, and that caused a whole cascade of disastrous wildfires in California. And then in 2018, we probably all remember the Paradise tragedy. A live wire broke free of a tower that was 25 years past what is considered useful life. So in engineering, every piece of equipment, it doesn't matter if it's a permanent building, a permanent structure, everything has what's considered a useful life. And you have to replace air handling units, and you have to replace chillers, and you have to replace your switch gear where your power comes into your building. You have to replace those generators. And unfortunately, a lot of that infrastructure doesn't get replaced. It doesn't get replaced in our power systems. It doesn't get replaced in our buildings. And that can really lead to a lot of failures. So we do know that the power system just fails when we don't take care of it. And in an apocalypse, we can't take care of it. So anyway, I hope that wasn't too depressing. I just really wanted to set the record straight on what a lot of movies and shows get wrong. I'm going to stick around for questions at the end. Thank you for listening to me, and I am going to toss it back to either Rufus or Matt. To Rufus. I'm tossing it back to Rufus. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. That is, yes, slightly terrifying, but also I think it's very helpful for people to realize how vulnerable, but how important and critical our infrastructure is. Because if we don't take care of the infrastructure that we have, it's very easy for these things to get away from us in the modern life that we enjoy so much. all that infrastructure kind of falls apart, right? Because I don't know about you, but on that topic of squirrels, it really triggers something out of the back of my head because I've been in this situation where I've heard that pop, I've watched all my power go out, and then I've sat for an hour or two, and the truck comes up, and then the guy, like 3 guys get out of the truck and work on stuff for an hour or two, and then they leave. And then, so if you're in the zombie apocalypse, right, you there's not going to be a truck of people coming in an hour, and they're not going to have 2 unfettered hours while zombies aren't attacking them to fix your distribution, your transmission right by your house, right? So, but I digress. We're going to switch it over. Rachel mentioned physics happening to us and us being victims of physics. And we have a great speaker that can tell you a little bit more about physics and how you can be a victim of physics on your own. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hit us with the physics.
All right, thanks. Hello and good evening. Those of you who maybe recognize me as your voice of GenCon on behalf of Pastimes and the city of Indianapolis, welcome to the best 4 days in gaming. Yes, that's right. I'm a nerd too. I do this for fun. Face for radio. I wanted to share my screen with you if I can figure out how to actually do that share screen button. Hey, desktop 1. Let's see if that works. Share. Apparently I need to do this. Apparently. Okay. Sorry.
You are totally fine. I was just admiring your very nice microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Figure out why you get that.
I've got to quit and come back apparently. 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. So while Matt gets that squared away, what I will do is I will remind you guys that this is live science communication. So we appreciate your patience. We are Indiana Sciences. We are a science communication nonprofit here in Indianapolis. And what we do is we try and take science of your everyday lives in this fiction, fantasy, all the different ways that you interact with science and don't realize it, and all these different genres, and make it interesting and very engaging. So without further ado.
Sorry. We'll try this again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, it's working. All right, thing of beauty. I should full screen this thing. And present. Hey, I'll even turn on my little pointer because I'm very easily entertained by fake laser pointers. Hello and welcome. As a mechanical engineer by trade, I very much enjoy doing nerdery personally. So I started playing Dungeons and Dragons a very long time ago, and definitely before I had any understanding of physics or whatever, but I just really enjoyed the idea of role-playing games that had this aspect of role-playing. You've got this aspect of adventuring, you've got this exploration thing, you've got combat, but puzzle solving. So part of the puzzle solving there ends up being stuff I can just sort of do better now. So through practice of 4 decades worth of role playing, I suppose, as I'm in my 4th decade of doing these sorts of games, hooray for that, and continuing to play. And I'm learning new stuff all the time about the systems and how they work. And I really highly encourage everyone to really sink their teeth into whatever system that you like. Part of it's always going to be the system for role playing or for dice rolling, but the rest of it's, what you bring to the table. So, with this kind of information, then you can use what you do and how you approach stuff in your gaming. So maybe you feel sorry for the parties that I DM because I do have a mechanical engineering background, so the traps I make are fairly nasty. So I'd like to present this one to you as the players see it first, and then we'll sort of walk through it. My focus today is going to be really just talking about potential energy. So gravity pulls down, so keep that in mind. So you carry on the trail of the assassins. They're following a party of assassins, fleeing town into the open rolling plains. The trail follows a footpath over the next rise to a slight depression crossed with a deep holloway with a large boulder on one side sticking up to the level of the surrounding landscape. Its top is flattened and scooped slightly to form a cairn, a channel cut in its face to lead to the floor of the holloway, which disappears from sight as your approach Doesn't let you see inside the holloway channel. This is a top view in the picture, by the way. So as you circle around up here down the holloway from either end, you can see the base of the cairn channel ends in an undercut where a thick oak barrel acting as a cistern rests wedged up against it to collect the rainwater. Across from it is opening low and wide, leading to an underground cave structure. So now we've walked down on the holloway. The holloway's let us down. We can see the side view here. I've got it cut away so you can see down the channel in the earth here. You see a low, wide cavern entrance hewn into the rock from human stone-cutting tools. A rusty maul lays unused near the entrance, cast aside at the corner of the entrance. The corridor is nearly 8 feet wide and maybe 7 feet tall, oval slightly in cross-section with the middle tamped down from decades of use. The corridor slopes downward steadily past the limits of your sight. So, the players at this point took a minute to take a look at this, and it was pretty smart that they did. I put a physics mark on here. You'll see this thing I've got highlighted here called the center of gravity. In other words, that's where the acting line of gravity tries to pull down on the object. So in the world of physics, we like to simplify thinking about an object by point mass when we can for Newtonian physics, which in the world of mechanical engineering is most of what all of us do. So there's a flat on the top here. It collects rain. It pours down the front, drips into this barrel. The barrel is being held up by a brace. The brace is really non-obvious as to what its purpose is because it looks like it's just there to hold the barrel, when in fact the fulcrum of a large stone lives back here, separate stone that it's sitting on. And you can see that its contact point is not on the line of action. Because there's no support under this, this means that it has the ability to tip. So if this brace wasn't here, just holding it with just enough force to balance it and hold it there indefinitely, it might fall forward and maybe plug this hole. If you bother to look at the strangely loose gravel, that kind of tipped them off at the same time that they saw the moss growing down the front of this and was like, oh, that's probably pretty slippery looking. Somebody found the hammer that was there and eventually started digging around and pulled the debris out from behind the stone to take a look down at the base and found this fulcrum here. And then the dwarf started looking at this going, yeah, that doesn't look great. This could tip over and plug this hole, and that would be bad, especially if we're down there and this is the only way out. So wisely, the warlock took their immobile rod and put it right on the face of the stone here to hold it to keep it from tipping over, even if somebody popped the brace. I didn't actually do the math on the mass of the stone, but let's say it's sufficient enough to plug a hole. So they have the ability to look at these things. If you're DMing this, the backside of this, aside from creating a trap where you can stick people down in a hole because holes are harder to come out of. Anybody who does climbing tells you you can fall down from wherever you climb, but people who do caving and spelunking, I suppose, could jump down to places they could not later climb out of. So there is a exceptional dose of terror you can give to characters when your options are a deep, dark hole or the plug that forms it. So this is gauged for about level 5. I threw some XP at the folks to give them the ability to, think through this. And if you avoid it, there should be some sort of reward for not dying to a trap. It's the monster you didn't have to defeat, right? So in this case, there is no subterranean escape from this cave system. So they could get trapped down here for a long time. If they have food and that sort of thing and they can dig, they have to figure that out. Of course, if they were trying to dig their way out, the stone will continue to shift under it. So if you're just pulling the gravel and stuff out of the way, this thing just keeps falling and then gravity will continue pulling it tighter and tighter down in the hole, which is generally not the right way out. Better have some stone shaping capability at some point. So the back half of this then is pretty insidious as well. So as you move forward 30 feet, you spy an opening hewn from the corridor to your left about 30 feet ahead. That's here. The sloping corridor ahead of you ends in a large round door some 6 feet wide with large iron rings, iron hinges on the right, and a heavy iron ring set on the left side of the door. So as the party was looking down here, they did not notice the tripwire that's coming across the hall to the page towards us here, tied to a rock or something like that, and then run through a ring. runs through another guide and comes all the way down here to a guide. This wooden door has a thin leather flap on it that hides the fact that that's not part of the door and it's actually a hole. Behind here is a ballista, which is a massive crossbow. For those of you familiar with that thing, it's basically a horizontally laying bow. And it is activated by a ratchet and a crank. So you have to crank this bad boy down because the projectiles it launches are these ballista bolts, which are basically spears. It's a good 4-foot pike that's a good 2 inches in diameter of at least solid wood and probably shod with iron. It will leave a hole. So tripping on this thing does a pretty tremendous amount of damage, and that's super bad. The other part of the trap that they cannot see that's behind this also then is that attached to the mechanism, it's hooked to a bell so that if the trap is tripped, it rings a bell. The fascinatingly conspicuous door that's halfway along here actually leads off to where the bad guys are and some barracks and that sort of thing. So I gave them a difficulty class to notice this, which was very good. The druid in the party, good job, druids, good job, clerics. Just walking around with a high-ass wisdom is very useful. So they noticed the trip line here and didn't really know what was going on, decided to just unhook the trip line and then walked all the way down to the door, sneaking, managed to not make any noise and alert the people on the other side of the door. Figured out what they where they were at, and you can see here that's a pretty nasty thing. It's a +6 to hit and 3d10 damage, which is pretty serious. If everybody's level 5, that will leave a mark. So what happened is they snuck down here, and one of them went invisible, and the other one hid, and the other 3 characters were hiding in here and closed this door behind them. One of the bad dudes came out, walked up the corridor because he thought he heard them. Stands here, notices the tripwire is disconnected, proceeds to bend over to fix the tripwire, and was met with a surprise from a ballista. So he did not have a good day. So this, again, if you have this stone behind you thing where these guys can run out of this hole, all they had to do was run out of here, take them all, knock the rock out, and then the whole party's trapped down here with all of this business. But it was not to be. They were very stealthy, and that's why we leave randomness up to dice. That's the other part of the physics of the universe here. So let's take a look at this then in cutaway again. And so from a top view here, I'm taking the fact that I have a regular plains area that is at a high elevation with a holloway that's cut through it. So you have to be at a vantage point where you can see the holloway in the first place. They happen to be following the trails of some bad guys so they could figure it out. The second thing is that by hiding it in a hole, you still have the ability for other people who can hide in these tall grasses to drop objects on them or whatever and provide room for attack. Similarly, then the players are exposed down in this holloway once they get down into here, that anyone else who happens to be coming along that knows what this mall is here for can actually plug the hole, but they might not do so if they knew they had friends down in there because it's really hard to do. So if you look at this, the amount of technology that goes into this is pretty low. And it's a pretty straightforward design, and it uses gravity to pull things down. And you let gravity do the work, and you don't have to really overthink things. So the truth is gravity pulls down all the time, whether you want it to or not. And that's like 90% of the traps that I use are all gravity-fed type mechanisms. That adds a lot to the realism when there's a technology that's available at the time that these folks would have been using. Plus, it love to think through these thought experiments in the case you ever need to construct some of these in your own home or nearby. I'm kidding. Anyway, do not build traps at home. Check your local laws. Let's see, then the second thing to remember is the springs and elastic elements are great until they're not great. So that means they typically fail over time. So in the case of this ballista that's down here, it would have some elastic element, which would be like the bending of the bow itself, which still could be a metal spring or a piece of metal that makes the bow itself. But the string itself is bendy as well. So that would require maintenance. It would require loading and unloading. So you have to keep that in mind to add to the realism that this isn't going to be some 500-year-old artifact laying in the bottom of some ancient temple because it's, well, spring-loaded. But this is basically gravity fed. And if you can figure out a way to have sliding stones or things like that, you have an excuse to push a boulder over on people, a la Indiana Jones. Works every time. Let's see. Remember that players are curious. And if you've got some scientific skill to you, or you can think at least in a scientific fashion, this type of creation and creativity is not just an exploration for you, but if you then think about how you present this to them, to the players, it adds to their curiosity too. So a good magic trick always is keeping the people interested in watching it. So this is a magic trick that we're doing, right, as DMs. So we should be able to reward them for sticking with it, and we present this to them in this way. Had I simply just shown them all the mechanisms of how to defeat the trap, then it's not interesting at all. But your own ignorance makes it terrifying. So if you want to talk about terrifying stuff, the previous two speakers are way more terrifying than this. This is just people being mean to each other. The other stuff is, I mean, zombies. You can't control nature. You're just going to become a zombie. With that in mind, your knowledge of science currently really surpasses a lot of that of most folks about 500 years ago. So we have the feature of things like public education and stuff like that didn't exist before. So don't be afraid to just put your brain space out there and really come up with something that's crazy. I mean, all science fiction begins with somebody who's a writer who thinks that wouldn't it be cool to say, I don't know, have a laser sword. I mean, I want a laser sword. I'm still working on one, but that's like a thing we should have. But I promise you that I'm wearing Dick Tracy's watch right now. And if anybody played Shadowrun in first or second edition, they have a device called a pocket secretary, which is this thing. This piece of science fiction became science fact in my lifetime. So I think there's a lot of use and utility in science fiction and fantasy for people to kind of, find some anachronism that forces you to constrain how you do things like design. So for me, this is engineering design 101. And if you can just do it with moving rocks, you'll do all right. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Physics are absolutely like oh, no. Oh, can you guys hear me? What happened to the testing? Can you hear me? Matt, can you hear me?
I don't know what had happened.
Awful
Hey everyone,
quiet.
Rufus is having
There.
some technical difficulties, so he's actually going to hop onto my audio and take us away. So hang on just 1 second.
Thanks. And I love looking at the pictures and icons of people in the chat area. Somebody's got the face of Aku, and I dig it.
All right, can you guys hear me now? Awesome.
There we go.
So what we're going to do now is we're going ahead and roll into questions. So first off, thank you everybody for joining us. It is great to have everybody here. We are Indiana Sciences. We are a local nonprofit volunteer run. And if you like our presentation, you like what you've heard so far, please follow us at Indiana Sciences on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And if you like this presentation, you can find a recording of it on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So with that, we have 3 guest experts who have shared these very cool presentations. What questions do you have for them? You can type them in the chat, or if you'd like to at this time, come off mute and ask your question. Please feel free to do that now.
So Rufus, if you don't mind, I see a question in the chat that asks if the book I wrote is influenced by psychoanalyst perspective in any form. If not, where did you find references for the behavior of humans? Okay, so there's definitely some psychological components to it, but it's all rooted in peer-reviewed literature. There's an extensive bibliography in the back of the book, divided by each chapter, that refers to the original peer-reviewed studies I didn't include anything in the book that was not peer reviewed or just from some random blog post or magazine article. It had to be rooted in and vetted in scientific research. And I can, so if it wasn't all psychology, where's most of it? As the title implies, the subtitle is Genes, Germs, and the Curious Forces That Make Us Who We Are. And some of those germs I referred to tonight in the form of like Toxoplasma gondii, if some of those correlation studies are in fact true, we have billions of people in the world infected with this parasite living latently in their brain, but potentially affecting their behavior in maybe subtle or more profound ways we currently don't know. But there is precedence for that possibility being fleshed out in rodent models, which in my mind isn't a certain yes, it's this really warrants some serious attention. And there's other microbes that are profoundly important, gaining a lot of attention, the ones that live in our intestines, otherwise known as the microbiome. These have been connected to all sorts of different diseases, disorders, and now behavioral issues as well, everything from overeating to depression to even how brave someone can be. These things seem to be influenced in part by the various types of microbes that live in your gut and talk to your brain, okay, through biochemistry. So that's a big component of the book and an emerging aspect of research. And another big part is genes and how your environment affects them. And that's a subdiscipline called epigenetics. And it turns out that I think everyone's pretty familiar with genes and that they have pretty far-reaching effects on our personality and behavior. But the environment has a very strong component as well, because it can control the activity of those genes through various chemical modifications that scientists call epigenetics. And I break that all down in very plain English, but almost everything you encounter in the environment, from the type of diet you consume to what sort of toxins you may breathe in or pick up from all the plastics, to even psychological trauma. It turns out that they're codified in various biochemical machineries within our cells that can change behavior. But the cool thing about those is they're also reversible. So that gives us a really neat therapeutic aspect to work on. So in a nutshell, those are some of the examples of the things I explore. So hopefully that answers your question.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Great answer. And I think you actually answered a follow-up question that Raxo had. So nice predictive powers there. Our next question from Becky is for Matt. And so, Matt, it looks like we've got a situation where DM sets up a scenario where they're stuck and they have to dig out a hole, and a player wants to use a laser sword and riffs to try and to rip up this area, help them with the physics, because this person rage quit and we need to set the rules straight. So
right. You know, first off, if somebody's going to rage quit, you don't need them at your table. Secondly, you know, it's a group sharing experience. So if you're not doing collaborative gaming, when this is indeed the only actual form of collaborative gaming where literally every other type feels competitive to me, then yeah, we should probably collaborate on that stuff and get along as people. Anyway, that stuff aside, if you're using a mining laser and you're like going into like earth, like just clay and stuff like that, that's not going to work. Now, if you're on a space rock, which is like, I don't know, largely ice or something like that, then yeah, you could actually just melt right through that sucker because it's dust or whatever, because it's like a comet. And then if you're getting to something that's like, this is like polished dwarf stone or whatever, you know, ain't no mining laser going to get through that. Largely, you are correct that it takes a lot of energy to heat up rock, and heating up any kind of rock takes a massive amount of energy. So there's going to be nothing that you as a human can transport that would allow you to use heat to cut through a rock as much as we want that to happen. I don't think the technology exists, but if we can get cold fusion the size of my Coke can here, I promise you, then you might be able to have such a thing if you wanted to. But that's up to George Lucas to see if the lightsabers can cut through those blast doors, because I haven't ever seen them go through a wall, but they always go through blast doors. I'm like, isn't the wall like less reinforced because the blast doors closed? Like they're all there now, so the gaps and compartments where the blast doors were are completely empty. Can't you just go through there anyway? So I don't challenge writers with screenplays. I'm not a writer, just applying the thing. But I'm with you. I would like, I would have said, go fly a kite, buddy, and sayonara. We'll see you some other campaign.
Nice. Go fly a kite is always a great response to bad physics questions. So looking at a follow-up question for Bill, mice seem to lose their fear for cats, but they also spent more time in cat areas. And so how's that kind of fit in? I think I butchered the question. Can you see it in chat, Bill? I tried to summarize as I read, and I kind of broke it. So I'll just turn it over to you.
No, that was how I interpreted Becky's question as well. And if we got it wrong, Becky can correct us. There's actually been a number of studies that have looked at this phenomenon of toxoplasma infected rodents and their behavior in or around a cat or not. So this is a number of studies done by independent labs all over the world. The phenomenon seems very real and reproducible, but the extent of it can vary depending on what type of mouse it's in, whether it's in a mouse versus a rat, and what type of cat urine you use. Okay, we actually ordered bobcat urine off Amazon.com when we started doing these experiments in the lab, because the biological supply companies were too expensive. And the bobcat urine we got from Amazon did not work at all. It smelled really bad, but apparently the rats and mice, even uninfected, they didn't really care it was there. So what I'm trying to say is there's a whole lot of experimental variables. Even though these setups seem simple, there's a lot of nuances to them that can modify results. But the common thread throughout all of them is that these infected rodents and mice, on average, don't scurry away when they smell cat odor. And a part of that may be related to the fact that the infected mice and rats are more hypermodal, meaning they move around a lot more. That's a very observable phenotype as well. So some more recent studies that have been done have suggested that these mice are more anxious and less afraid and move around regardless of the cat odor. So some people have found that if they just put other stimuli in the cage that a mouse or rat would normally be afraid of, they also aren't afraid of that either. So the newer studies suggest that there's a generalized loss of fear, not necessarily specific to the cat, but just in general, which would still help the parasite ultimately get to where it needs to go. But what I'm trying to say with Becky's answer is that there's still a lot more research that we need to do, and in order to try to nail down these peculiar behavior effects that are occurring in the brain. So Becky, if that didn't answer your question, feel free to give us a follow-up.
Awesome. Great questions. We've got one coming in from the live streams, because we're also live streaming on our Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. This one's for Rachel. And the question is, you always see people going and getting gasoline or diesel and filling up their generators and running these generators to keep their compounds going during the apocalypse. How long does that, unleaded gasoline or diesel or whatever last in the apocalypse?
All right, so I'm going to interpret that question as how long, let me turn my video on so you can watch me roll my eyes. Here we go. So I'm going to interpret that question.
I mean,
Thanks,
the
Matt.
exact reason to have you on video is because I can also hear your eyes rolling. That's the best part.
Right, right. So far back, I can see my brain. But so I'm going to interpret that question as how long can you run your generator after an apocalyptic event? And there are a couple answers to that question. So most generators are fueled by either natural gas, which comes from your public utilities, or diesel. So if you have, and I will say, as an electrical engineer, when I'm talking with clients and they want a backup generator, I always recommend, even though by code you are allowed to have a natural gas generator, and that's considered a separate source of energy, it's still a utility. So if your utilities fail, your natural gas generator might not be that reliable. So I always recommend diesel generators to clients when we're going down that road. And I will, let me preface this with I'm not a chemist, chemical engineer, material scientist. This is truly from the experience of an electrical engineer. Diesel fuel starts to break down. So with generators, there are a few reasons you want to test them monthly, and part of that is that you don't want old fuel sitting in your tank in your facility. There are a number of ways that it can break down, including getting infected with bacteria or fungi. And I actually learned, so Clostridium, and obviously there's probably a billion different strains of Clostridium. And again, I know nothing about like medical science, bacteria, any of that, but I always think that it's funny that diesel can get a Clostridium infection, because like that humans can get Clostridium infections, dogs can get them. But anyway, so if you have a generator with a diesel tank on it, you're testing your generator regularly to spin that fuel, and you're also putting additives in your fuel to keep it from breaking down and keep it from getting sick with one of these infections. I'm not being serious with that. I know they're not real. They're not sentient. They don't get sick. But again, not a chemist, but that fuel is not really going to keep your generator running that long. To be honest, if you're trying to doomsday prep, I would invest in a small wind turbine, like a residential size wind turbine, if you live like on a lot of acreage, or if you're in a good location without a lot of tall trees around. A solar array, a solar array is something that you can somewhat maintain yourself, and you could potentially keep it running. And the same thing with a wind turbine. You could potentially, if you know what you're doing, keep them going. But that is also, it sounded like that might be a kind of a question, like, is this real? That's another one of my pet peeves. But again, I don't have that deep fundamental education on the chemistry side, just my experience with generators as an electrical engineer. Hope I answered your question. If not, feel free to follow up and tell me how badly I misunderstood.
But so basically what you're saying is we can't be in season 8 or 9 or whatever, The Walking Dead, be almost 10 years out and still be siphoning gas out of cars that works, basically, right? That's probably not going to be the case.
You mean Mad Max is not real?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So we got about 5 minutes left for questions. If folks want to answer, I was trying to keep up in the chat. I don't know if we missed any questions, but one of the questions that we did get was, what other online activities does Indiana Sciences have? I would love to answer this question. So we have a monthly book club called Books, Booze, and Brains. And what we do is we pick a set of books 2 seasons a year, so 2 5-month seasons. And what we do is we pick a book that has a science theme, and then we have an expert in that book's subject area come and lead a discussion at a local brewery, or during the pandemic we did it online, but we also always live stream like we're doing now and answer those questions. So if you follow us on Indiana Sciences, you'll see our new season. We're doing Blood Child, a really cool piece of science fiction, Afrofuturism. This month, it'll be the last Tuesday of the month. And those start at 6:30 p.m., so about a half an hour earlier than this. So follow us online and you'll get the live stream of that. And you'll get to join in a conversation with us. So in addition to Books, Booze, and Brains, thank you, Rachel, we do several different conventions and we live stream all those. So we do Indie PopCon, where we do we do talks about the real science behind a lot of other different pieces of science and science fiction. And then we also do Starbase Indie in the fall, where we do a lot of the science of Star Trek and what was predicted in those shows and what's become a reality.
Sounds like Becky needs to come join that one and maybe bring some friends too, where I can talk about adamantium and vibranium and all these other materials.
Transparent
aluminum, man.
Yeah, that's one of
Real
Matt's
thing.
favorites. Yeah, that's. But yeah, please follow us on at Indiana Sciences. Join the discussions. Join the fun. And if there are any scientists on the call, because I saw that we mentioned some, and you have a talk that you'd like to give and things like this, in this brave new all virtual world where we're doing all of our events in person and virtual, a lot of opportunities to collaborate and to share expertise, which we always find amazingly fun. So
it's a way to drink and know things. And
yes,
if you like drinking and knowing things, this is a gig for you.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, they don't pay us or anything, but the Genovese Sun King beer is absolutely fantastic. If you're in the area, I really suggest you check it out for everyone over 21. For everybody who's not, just wait. You're going to time travel and you'll eventually get there. It's a really cool phenomenon. You just wait a little bit and you'll end up being there. So with that in mind, I think that's all the questions that we had. We're at our time at 8:30. So I just want to say thank you again to all of our speakers, Professor Bill Sullivan, Professional Engineer Rachel Cochran, Patent Mechanical Wizard Extraordinaire Matt Sowers. It's been an absolutely fantastic experience. And we hope you'll join us again if you have time tomorrow at 7 p.m. We'll have a whole new panel of speakers doing talks like this. So thank you all so much. Follow us at Indiana Sciences, and everybody, please have a great evening.
Thanks.